Thank you. Thank you very much, Stuart. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Carnegie Library, Oberlin College, 1949, 44 years ago. A very confused, emotionally tangled, often unhappy young man, myself, wandered into this building, searching for something, but he didn't know what it was. I had come here before to study hard, but on this occasion I came because there was a little sign that said book sale. And the library was giving a little book sale of, it had gone through its stock and had winnowed out some books it didn't need, and so it was selling them. I wandered in. I bought 2 books. One of them was Sesame and Lilies by John Ruskin. And I thought, I didn't know anything about John Ruskin, but I thought anybody who'd name a book Sesame and Lilies couldn't be all bad, so I'd have to buy that book. And so I got that. And another book that I thought was about a popular comic strip that had just been inaugurated called Pogo. So I bought my Ruskin and my Pogo, and I took it back to my dorm, and when I had time with all the studies that I was doing, I got around to reading them. I didn't get very far through Sesame and Lilies. I am happy to know that Ruskin, in Reading the Times Literary Supplement, is alive, well, and read, partly because of the gossip that he remained publicly a virgin all his life, which I will leave you to make of what you will. In any case, that's nice, and I suppose sometime I will go back and maybe try to read John Ruskin, but I haven't done that. And so I put the book aside. Time went by, and then I turned to the other book, the Pogo book, and here it is. I brought it with me. I've kept it close to me all these years. It is not about Pogo, the comic strip. The spelling was P-O-G-G-I-O instead of Pogo. Oops, upside down. It cost 15 cents. There it is, 15 cents. I opened it. It said Broadway Translations, and a word that I kind of remembered, faceti, facetious, yeah. And I began to look at the long contents, and there were all these little bitty stories, and I realized that what I was looking at was a book of jokes. And I thought, well, okay. So I started to read this book of jokes. Now, I have to let you know a little something about my background in Madison, Tennessee, in the 1930s Depression years where I grew up. There was no public library at all that I remember. The South was still in its almost 19th century phase, and there was a gentleman named G. Gordon Kugler who made the couplet that Southern writers love, which is, "O South, her books grow fewer and fewer. She was never much given to literature." However, in a small town of the South, everything was dominated by 2 supreme and far-reaching authorities who were sometimes harsh. They were the high school and the church. Nobody escaped them. In my case, the Methodist Church, to which I was sent every Sunday and to which I went dutifully because I had to. I didn't like it very much. I was a rebel. I did not know how to rebel. I had all sorts of things that were happening inside me that I did not understand. But one of them was that I didn't like church very much. I did like it when they rented the Methodist Church out to revivalists who came by, and I went by myself without telling anybody. These were not the sort of American Tartuffes that we see on television making all that money and doing all those things. These were rather poor people who liked to be revivalists, and they sang lustily the wonderful old hymns, and they had people who came in and got down on the floor and beat it with their hands and did all sorts of marvelous things like that, and I loved them. But I wasn't quite so keen about the other authorities that really ruled my life, because what went on in the high school and what went on in the church had a great deal to do with the way you were able to function as a human being. I read, of course, but what I read, because there was no library, I read what was on the drugstore rack. I read Tarzan, of course, and Bamba the Jungle Boy, Ellery Queen, amazing stories. And Tarzan and Sherlock Holmes were wonderful. They still stalk through my mind with Hamlet. They are alive, like Hamlet, maybe not as dense, but still alive. And the mystery of creation is wonderful in them, and so on. But that was about all that I read. I later went to high school in Washington, D.C., but that was later high school, and I got all involved with hormones and basketball, and I listened to classical music very intently, but I didn't read very much, except a course that I took for a teacher named Mrs. Best, who was. And she made us read Jane Austen's Emma, which I began with some trepidation and ended up liking very, very much, as I still do. So when I came to Oberlin, what I can say is that I was a sort of a tabula rasa. I was a clean slate for something out of the ordinary, for something unusual, for something exciting, for something visceral, for something to do something to me. Another thing that happened to me one time, I wandered into Finney Chapel when the B minor Mass was being done. I was drunk. And I sat down and I got sober very quickly. And it is an experience, one of 3 or 4 that I had that freshman year that I will always remember. So this was another one of them. Maybe in terms of what happened to me, the most important of them all. I began to read. The first of these little jokes, Facetti, I thought was dumb. And then I started reading the second one, and the hair began to stand up on the back of my neck, and I'm going to read it to you. A pleasant story, which ought to have its place among these little tales, happened some time ago in Amalia. A married woman, moved, it would seem, by piety, went to confess her sins to a friar of the minor orders. The friar, listening to the woman's confession, was moved with desire and plied her so with words and youthful supplications that finally he won her to his passion, and it only remained between them to arrange the manner of their meeting. They made their plan out of the lightheartedness of their youth that the woman should feign a great sickness and should call her confessor to her bedside. It is the custom to leave the confessor and the penitent alone together for the greater liberty of the soul. So the woman feigned her malady, put herself to bed, complaining of a mortal pain, and asked for her confessor, who entered her chamber alone, everyone else having carefully retired. And the two of them played Cupid's game, not once but several times. The confessor's visit was so protracted that someone came into the room to see if all was well, whereas the friar took his leave of the woman, saying he would return the next day to hear the remainder of the confession, for it was very long. He returned the next day and was left alone with the woman. Removing his breeches, he laid them over a chair and continued to hear the confession in the same manner as on the previous day. Well, this little boy from Tennessee woke up in a hurry. I said, "What is this that I'm reading at Oberlin College? It's on the discard rack, I know that, but still, whoa, what's this?" The husband, who was not at all suspicious, nevertheless marveled at the length of this sacrament and suddenly entered the room. The friar slipped away, leaving his breeches behind him in his haste. The husband protested loudly, saying the man was not a friar but an adulterer, and he went to the prior of the monastery and made a great disturbance, violently threatening the guilty man with death. The prior, who was an old man and who had seen many things, sought to calm the husband's ire, saying that his loud-mouthed anger and violent reproaches turned little to the honor of his family, and that it was best to keep quiet about everything and hide it. The husband argued that the thing was manifest enough on account of the breeches, which the servants had all seen and couldn't be hidden, but the old prior found a way out of this too, saying that the breeches could pass for those of St. Francis, which the friar had taken as a holy relic to cure the wife. He would come and fetch them back to the monastery with great solemnity and pomp. So, the prior convoked the monks, and dressed in their sacred vestments, and with a large cross at the head of the procession, they repaired to the man's house and took the breeches away devoutly, as if they were a holy relic, and they placed them on a silken cushion, and made the husband and the wife kiss them as they did all they met on the way. With chants and prayers and ceremonies, they bore the breeches back to the monastery. Later, the facts were uncovered, and a commission of inquiry was sent to look into the sacrilege. Now, I read this, and I thought, if this is what the library discards, what is in the library? I love the blasphemy of it. It took a dead aim at authority. I knew very little about the medieval church, but I knew something about the Methodist Church in Madison, Tennessee, and I thought this was very interesting. And I laughed, I grinned, I was in love, I was very happy. This little piece was violently anti all things that I was told had to be good, and I better believe they're good. But I noticed that in this little story, while blasphemous, the abbot is an interesting man, possessed of two things that authoritarian systems, including religious ones and secular ones, often lack, and one of them is a sense of humor, and the other one is a common sense attitude about sex. Deficiencies, it seems to me, in all large systems of authority. Tolerance, acceptance of life as it is, and a delicious undermining of one's own great mission in life. How refreshing, how very unusual, never to be found on a drugstore rack. So this began a lifelong love of mine, of libraries and research, and of old book sales, of course. I love this story because it was totally unacceptable. But it excited me, and it made me understand what a theater was going to be later on. I didn't know this was happening, but it certainly was. And indeed, last year, I owed a theater a commission, and I took this little story after 44 years, after thinking about it for 44 years, and I put it to use. I had been reading, I obsessively read about various things from now, about the Inquisition in Spain and about Torquemada and all these terrible things. We all don't have to look very far at our world today to see that many things that we thought were buried in religious strife have suddenly reappeared. Catherine Ann Porter tells us that the things that she was most interested in were art and religion, and religion simply not because of the theological disputes of the matter, but because it puts such great demands on people. It drives them to extremes, and I think that is very evident in the headlines of the papers today. So I made this play, in which I took this little story after all these years, and finally I said, oh yes, okay, I know what to do with this story after all this time, and I made the inquisitor who comes back to find out about this, Torquemada. And the play, it's in 3 sections. That's the first section. And this abbot has died since, and his bones are, everybody's burned. Torquemada ends up burning everybody in this room. It's very funny when they go through all of this, but then he burns everybody. And the bones of the dead abbot are torn up out of the ground and thrown all around as they were. The second part is about a burned out American woman psychiatrist in New York today, who is researching this old abbot. There were in Spain at this time abbots, possibly because of the Moorish influence, who thought madmen were holy, who did a kind of mental psychiatric work. They went to the asylums and they took the inmates out. And they would, they had plenty of monks, one monk and one patient, and they would have little walks together. And of course this did schizophrenics, which I suppose they were at the time, a great deal of good. As our psychiatrists like Harry Stack Sullivan and people like that told us, that the most important people are the people who, the nurses on the wards, and the idea of one person being with you and caring about you and all of that. Well, I imagine that this abbot was one of those people who did that. And for a brief time that happened, and then it all got thrown away. Somebody decided it wasn't a good idea, so it all stopped. And I made the middle part of this about a burned-out American psychiatrist who sort of rejuvenates herself reading about this man and helping a young boy who's in trouble. And then I staged the play in New York because I owed the theater this commission. And then it was fine. Everybody liked it all right, but it wasn't finished. And this summer I finally then suddenly realized what I had been lacking and finished the play and I am very happy with it. The last section goes back to the monastery 5 years before the beginning, and we see this abbot, who by this time has grown into a character. I gave him a very fanciful name, Escobedo de la Eixa, an eccentric abbot of a Spanish monastery in the time of the Spanish Inquisition, who isn't doing what he's supposed to do at all. And he has there's a scene between him and one of the madmen from the asylum with whom he is talking and so forth. And the madman, with the great insight that schizophrenics often possess, sees the trouble coming and knows that this is all going to stop. And finally it all ends up with the abbot in the arms of the madman, and the madman comforting him and saying that we'll all go to heaven or something like that. So I'm very happy that this little story, after all these years, got done, and so I thought I would talk a little bit about this tonight. And while I was doing it and preparing this talk, I looked back over all my work, and I am astonished to find this little story not only the basis of this play, Spain, but I find it also in almost everything I've written somewhere, and I'm amazed. My novels is a book called Heathen Valley, which is about a mission in the mountains of North Carolina in the 1840s. There's a novel called Slowly by Thy Hand Unfurled, which is an almost illiterate woman's diary, which is based upon a fragment of a diary that somebody gave me. Jesus Tales that Stuart mentioned is based upon a very strange book called Italian Popular Tales that I found on the back porch at Yaddo a long time ago, which is about apocryphal folklore, Jesus and St. Peter getting in all sorts of trouble when they were young. Many of the plays that I've written, The Sorrows of Frederick is a play about Frederick and Voltaire, but not from a historical standpoint, but from many, though I indeed researched the life of Frederick the Great and Voltaire, but I incorporate a lot of the jokes and a lot of the things that happened to him. Holy Ghost is a play about snake handlers in the South that came from a brochure that I saw showing people holding diamondback rattlesnakes, which are as big as your arm, which bit them, and they died, some of them. I later went to some of the services and came to admire these people a great deal and to respect them a great deal. The play that is so very, very, to me, touchingly done and honestly and simply presented by the students here about the death of King Philip. People don't know too much about King Philip, as I didn't either, but he almost reconfigured the whole business of colonizing the United States, because he almost drove all the English settlers into the sea in 1675. Many of all these other things that I've been writing all these years, this little story somehow, in its brevity, in its straightforwardness, in its blasphemous humor, which I think is very healthy, as most artists do, by the way. When artists sit around and talk, that's sort of what they do. These were, in fact, little stories that taught me what it was I wanted to find, what it was that I wanted to search for in the libraries and in my life. For they were, in fact, the faceti that marked the early stirrings of the Renaissance. Poggio was Poggio, I don't know how to pronounce it, somebody here knows better than I, Bracciolini, I think, who was the leading writer of these faceti. There were many others. And they used bawdy peasant humor written out in Latin to express a kind of humor and with humor and irreverence the coming of a new age that was not afraid of the authority that had dominated human beings for a long, long time. Saying, I don't know, maybe that human beings are not the slaves of their beliefs, no matter what those beliefs may be. So I owe this library a great deal for this little story. How to give back something to Oberlin College Library for what I received? Well, there is one little way that maybe I can do it, which I hope, the act of which I hope will be more eloquent than anything that I can say. I'm not going to give you the book, because I will keep this book with me always. It means a great deal to me. But perhaps Ray English will accept for the library that served that young student so well a new book of my plays, and with it 44 years of this writer's gratitude. Thank you very much.